Hello everyone and welcome to my presentation on Adobe Lightroom CC. In contrast to previous weeks, I decided to tackle here a software completely by itself because I have absolutely no idea of how to utilize Lightroom before. So I never knew the purposes, I never knew the usage, or never knew the approach and value that Lightroom could add to the repertoire of a media producer. So that is what I'm going to be trying to communicate to you today, going through the fundamentals, the basics, the sort of experimentation that I have gone under, and then how I can apply it to different things, because this is going to be a two-part presentation. So this is going to be the first, and then I'm going to do the second one. First of all, I would like to present to you then what is the definitions that I have come up with Lightroom after utilizing it for already this reading week. And I have defined Lightroom not as a software, but rather as an ecosystem. Because Lightroom is a cloud-based service that literally gives you the ability to upload any picture that you take with your phone, with your camera, with anything, with any device, and just simply upload it to the cloud, and you can edit it on the fly because it tracks the changes and updates it simultaneously, which is impressive. And then you can see it on that device at the very same time. So you can basically be editing from your laptop and editing on your phone at the same time, which is incredible. When it came to learning Lightroom, I have these three main sources of information. Those were Adobe Help, lynda.com, and YouTube tutorials, which Adobe Help and lynda.com have great introductory tutorials to give you the right approach and definitions as to what Lightroom actually is. But YouTube tutorials serve very important in this particular investigation, I would say, in this particular presentation, because when it came to knowing what are the negatives of Lightroom and the contrast between both Lightroom Classic, and also those two to Photoshop, I wanted to know some user experience, and that is what YouTube brings to the table within this research. So this next slide is very important when it comes to understanding the way that I approach the learning process within Lightroom, because since I'm a proficient user of Photoshop, when I always learned something new in Lightroom, I would inherently compare it to how I would do it originally in Photoshop. So when it comes to similarities, they both read images in the very same way, which is nothing interesting. The editing, the filters, everything is basic and very similar between the two. But when it comes to differences, you have to go a little more technical. So in terms of Lightroom, it's a non-destructive editing software, meaning that it actually keeps an original save of the photo because you're editing a catalog, which is basically a rule book of the sequences, the series of actions that you have been making on your picture. Whilst in Photoshop, you are doing that. You are basically taking the original photo and working it from scratch. So every time that you make an action, Photoshop makes an instance of that. That is why Photoshop files are relatively larger in comparison to Lightroom. Lightroom is not only more efficient in the way that it approaches its workflow and editing tools, which is something I'm going to explain later, but it also is more efficient in the way that it utilizes, technically speaking, your image. The reality is that Lightroom is nothing out of the ordinary. I thought I was going to approach a beast, but rather it's kind of like a puppy. It just makes everything more efficient in the way that it utilizes, and the accessibility therefore for the software is way more user-friendly. We're talking about changes, for instance, of having the grid line change to different proportions, for instance, for you to see how your picture would fit with different aspect ratios, or having here the golden, I think it's the golden curve that will show you the rule of third with just a simple shortcut. Lightroom beats Photoshop when it comes to those time-saving moments and just gives you extra features that perhaps in Photoshop it would seem just impossible to have. Additionally, these are things that I would like to investigate more, but from the offset, for instance, using presets, which is something that Lightroom gives you, all the things that I've mentioned before as the prior presentation, for instance, with actions that I did on Photoshop, the actions are already here and you're already saved, so you don't have to work around recording your own action. And on top of that, for instance, the feature of versions gives you the ability to save the instance of your image as one, and then you can go back to a different instance. So for instance, I edit an image and with a red filter, and I like that, but then I want to see how it looks for a blue filter. I don't have to export that image then to save it. I can just simply have it in Lightroom, store there, and then see with what I like with the blue. And then I can just compare the two within the same software and look at what I want to do best with it. When it comes to the presentation next week, I want to go a little more in depth and advanced in the way that I approach this. So I want to learn more about meta tags and tags itself, how you can create profiles for each picture, so then you can add your copyright and things like that. But there's an automated way to do it within Lightroom, so that's kind of what I want to approach. And then I also want to see how you can add sharing and the functionality of working with different people within the same space in Lightroom. And also I want to see the integrations that there is between Lightroom and Photoshop. That's going to be my presentation for today, and I believe that I made a substantial increase when it came to my understanding of the software. I went from a 0 out of 10 to a 7 out of 10. Lightroom is nothing out of the ordinary, and it's going to be a tool that I utilize now to administrate every single picture that I make to do it. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next week.